Good morning. Thank you, Bruce, for those kind remarks. And I had the pleasure of growing up not mowing the lawn for my family lawn, but proofreading articles for Leonardo. And so indeed, the Leonardo network is full of personal anecdotes. And I can testify from my teenage years that it was not always easy. And it's indeed with great pleasure that I join with you today to celebrate not only the 10th anniversary of Digital Salon, but its relaunching for its future activities through this symposium, Vectors, Digital Art of Our Times. And as Bruce said, I'm here representing today the Leonardo network of artists, scientists, and engineers, and many of you in the room belong to that loose-lit network of professionals. And our network is anchored by two nonprofit organizations. One is Leonardo ISAST in San Francisco, and one is Leonardo OLATS in Paris. And with these two nonprofits, we've been trying to build infrastructures and support for this growing creative community. The mission of the Leonardo organizations has been very simple from their inception. The first is to document, make visible, and to advocate loudly the work of artists involved with contemporary science and technology. The second goal is to provoke collaboration and creative friction between artists, scientists, and engineers, and the Leonardo network feels that such work is vital, is crucial to creating a new planetary culture that shapes our own times. In this talk, as I was reflecting on what I might say to open the symposium, I thought I'd do something a little bit different. I don't know if it's the jet lag or the pain we all feel at reading the international news these days, but I thought I would try and provide a context from the history of the Leonardo network. And I want to maybe articulate what I see as an underlying urgency that permeates all of you and the community of people that we work with. And I want to help maybe make explicit one of the reasons why I feel that we are still very much at in the stone age of the digital arts. When Tim Binkley originally contacted Leonardo to collaborate and start producing not only the catalog, but also working in connection with events such as today, our board of directors quickly agreed to join that collaboration. And indeed, we felt at that time, and in some senses it's still true, that there was a real need within this country, within the United States, to create additional places where the tribe could gather in the same way that indeed in Europe, Ars Electronica and a number of other events such as DEF and so on have not only provided places to show work, but helped drive and contextualize future development through the interaction of the people in the community. So we did feel that there was, and there still is, for a venue like Digital Salon. Secondly, because of the nature of the Leonardo network, we've always worked in collaboration with distant individuals or remote organizations. That's just how the way that we work. Most of you would be amazed to see the Leonardo headquarter offices in San Francisco. I think we hotel 3 desks, and so people work at home and occasionally in the office. It's a very, very small group of people that's in that particular hub. And all of our work really is inside the community that you represent and in collaboration with individuals and organizations. And so, for instance, today we have very active collaborations with a very good group in London called Arts Catalyst, with the V2 organization in Rotterdam that many of you know, and a number of organizations and individuals in a growing way in Southeast Asia, South America, and Latin America, as well as Eastern Europe. This year we started working with UNESCO on their new digital arts project called DigiArts. It's been a delight to see international bureaucracy like UNESCO trying to get its hands around the same issues that you're dealing with. And of course, UNESCO is dealing with ministers of culture in Cuba and Venezuela and Zambia and all kinds of countries where indeed the digital arts are still very much an open question. And like you in this community, we are trying to reimagine how we might work together in new collaborative ways, collective ways, cooperative ways in this new connected world to produce something that really not only has value, but in fact changes the ways the world is going to function. And indeed, the collaboration with Digital Salon is one example of the way that we choose to work. Let me just make a footnote. I'd like to just thank many of you in the audience that rallied around Leonardo a few years ago when we were the subject of a $1 million lawsuit by a venture capital fund that claimed we were infringing their use of the word Leonardo. It was a very unpleasant situation for us, and a number of individuals and organizations in New York, such as Rhizome and Artmark and a number of other groups, rallied around, in fact, to really help us fight that lawsuit successfully. And we're now the proud owners of the word Leonardo, and we've been desperately trying to give it away again. But our IP lawyers tell us that as soon as we do that, someone else can trademark it. So anybody here that wants to use the word Leonardo in their projects, please do so. You can take this as verbal consent from me. But seriously, I do want to thank the community that rallied around. I think the judge in Paris received something like 8,000 letters and emails. A number of foundations helped us. The Rockefeller Foundation, Longueur Foundation helped us in that period. And indeed, I can tell you that sitting in the editorial office, we really felt part of a community of interest, of shared interest out there. The flagship projects of the Leonardo organization are publications, and they're numerous and multiplying as new ways of distributing information have arisen. The Leonardo Journal, which the catalog is one example of, the Leonardo Music Journal and CD series, Leonardo Digital Reviews, edited by Mike Punt in Wales, which is now a premier reviews journal. Our online projects, Leonardo Online and Leonardo Electronic Almanac, edited by Nisa Keshvani, currently in East Africa, editing the next issue. And also the Leonardo Book Series that Joel Slayton, he chairs the Book Series Committee. And then our other projects include the Leonardo Prize and Awards Program, and I think Lynn Hirschman is in the room. She chairs that committee for our annual Prize and Awards. And we're involved in numerous conferences and workshops like this one around the planet, trying to bring together disparate points of view on many of these issues. The oldest of our projects is indeed the Leonardo Journal, a peer-reviewed scholarly journal published currently with the MIT Press. The journal was founded in the 1960s, and as I explained, I used to proofread pages of the journal as a teenager in Paris, France, and we're now working on a 36th volume. Leonardo has not only been a witness to the emergence of the digital arts during this time period, but a very loud advocate that such kind of art making was crucial to our times. Over this period, I think we've published the work of something like 3,500 artists, scientists, and engineers, 3,500 if you go look at our author index. That is really a pretty nice community of interest, community of spirit. Most of those people have never met each other, and they're dispersed all over the planet. A few weeks ago, we were contacted by a small indexing company that proposed to us to create a dynamic semantic word and phrase index of our 36-year-old archive of Leonardo publications. The last time actually we did an index was in 1985, I think. It was one of the first projects I took on when I became executive editor, and it was carried out by George Agoston, then an assistant editor, using the tried and tested method of shoe boxes and pieces of cardboard. And recently I was in my mother's basement and I found those shoe boxes. And it was really kind of amusing to look at the instability of our vocabulary. And in fact, that has been symptomatic of the kind of work that we're working in. Machine art, cybernetic art, algorithmic art, even in those days was already defined. Computer art, electronic art, digital art, And today, of course, web art, new media art, interactive art, software art, code art have been added as interlocking layers to this growing house of the mind. Oliver Grau, who recently published a book in the Leonardo book series, describes the history of what he calls virtual art, tying digital work indeed to antecedents in other forms of technical expression. Steve Wilson, in a recent Leonardo book, talks about the information arts, a rather larger terrain of creative work. And recently I was working with Frank Popper in Paris, who's finalizing a manuscript. And the trouble is he's been working on this manuscript for 5 years, and so the title keeps changing. And so it's The History of Blank right now. And I guess when the book appears, he'll figure out in a moment of theoretical clarity what term he should be using, because of course he's talking about the history of art and technology over the last 50 or 60 years, and it's not at all clear what the right term to use. On the plane, I was reading a report that Michael Neymark is just finalizing for Leonardo, and he has a section on new art, which he claims encompasses all art forms that are committed to riding the wave of new science and technology as they are injected into the culture at large. And last week, for my sins, I was in Moscow, and I had the pleasure of meeting with a group of young artists and curators there that are currently building the Center for Actual Art, which I guess is yet another mutation of the terminology, because what they mean is very much digital art. So what are we really dealing with here? Why can't we describe the terrain we're exploring? Why is it so semantically unstable? Usually in an emerging interdisciplinary field, some of the first things to stabilize are the vocabulary and the terminology. Yet even today, in spite of the gigantic efforts of Louise Poisson and her dictionary team, there is really no clear hierarchy or arborescence or interconnected scheme for describing the digital arts and in all their variety. And our historical antecedents, say the Bauhaus tradition, or even in many of the art schools today setting up digital media programs, the digital arts tend to be added as another layer added to photography, film, painting, sculpture, theater, poetry, when indeed, as all of you know, the digital arts cut across these old divisions. I remember sitting on one of the Ars Electronica jury meetings. I think it was the first year that Ars Electronica made an interactive art prize. And the jury was totally deadlocked. We couldn't agree on who to give the prize for. And we had endless discussions trying to define interactive art. And Roy Ascott was on the jury, and he's very good at blocking jury meetings. And so he didn't want to talk about the digital part of interactive art. He wanted to talk about the art part, because he thought that was where the problem was. Nobody was changing the word art every 3 months, but everybody was changing the qualifier every 3 months. And so he felt the crux of the problem was that indeed we were not really making art, we were doing something else. As I remember, in spite of being unable to define our terms, we came to a very good decision on the prize that year. That anecdote reminds me, unfortunately, sadly, of Rich Gold, who was on the Leonardo Board of Directors for the last few years. And he was always insistent that what we were working was within a quadrivium of art, design, science, and engineering. And he asserted the right to oscillate at will between those very different poles of human activity and to refuse to be forced into any one of the boxes. When Rich Gold set up the Artist in Residence program at Xerox PARC, he really was very much open to outcomes that could fit into any one of those boxes and not necessarily drive a team of people to produce only one kind of product. And it's with great sadness, of course, that we lost Rich earlier this year. Michael Neymark is currently completing the study that I referred to before for Leonardo, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which outlines the bases for the kind of new hybrid organizations that might be created in the coming years, taking the lessons that were learned from Xerox PARC, Artist in Residence program, from interval research and some of the organizations that are no longer functioning, but also looking at the success stories of some of the other places, the Media Labs, the ZKMs, the Ars Electronicas, to see what one might glean as future routes. Michael, in a moment of unusual lyricism, has currently titled the report, Truth, Beauty, Freedom, and Money, which probably tells him where his angst is at right now. But the subtitle is Technology-Based Art and the Dynamics of Sustainability. And that whole issue of sustainability is, of course, one that's very much and foremost in our minds. And Bruce referred to the struggle he had putting the funding together for Digital Salon and the current turmoil in the international scene. But Michael Neymark again insists that these kind of future organizations have to sit astride Rich Gold's quadrivium of art, design, science, and engineering. Coming back to the discussion on the instability of the vocabulary of the digital arts, I feel that we have often misled even ourselves about the nature of the epistemological terrain that we're really working in. Even in the announcement of this symposium, we stated, and then I think we saw that on one of Bruce's view graphs there, that one goal for this conference is to create a better public understanding and awareness of digital art and its place in contemporary art. I just don't think that that's really what this creative community of people is fundamentally about, even though that's very much part of the important issues that we need to deal with, and over the next couple of days we'll be exploring those. A good friend of mine, Julian Gresser, is now retired. He was a professor at the Harvard Business School, and for many years he was a consultant to large companies that were trying to set up strategic alliances internationally. And Gresser, every time I see him, looks me in the eye and he tries to ask me, what is the pain that this Leonardo community is trying to deal with? What is the anguish that really motivates why in the morning we try and go do things that are so difficult to do? And indeed, Leonardo is going through a rethinking exercise right now to try and imagine what it is that we ought to be doing over the coming years. So where indeed is that pain? What is the problem that we're really trying to do with that our vocabulary is unable to catch up with? The Leonardo Network was started, as I said, in Paris by my father, Frank Malina, and a network of colleagues. And over the early years, the figures included leading scientists in France like Pierre Roger, François Le Lyonnais, very well known for his work with the Oulipo group of mathematics and literature, the Swiss artist Max Bill, Jacob Brunowski of Ascent of Man fame in the US, C.P. Snow of the Two Culture Debates fame, Joseph Needham, a leading historian of technology and expert on China, biologists such as C.H. Waddington, Lancelot Law White, art historians like Rudolf Arnheim, Ernst Gombrich, Buckminster Fuller, and many others. What was this community of spirit and what was their anguish? Paris in the late 1950s and early 1960s saw the emergence of what was later known as kinetic art, and Bruce referred to one book that came out of that movement. And that work occurred just before EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, originated here on the East Coast, as well as, for instance, the founding by Georgi Kepes of the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT. As pointed out by Lev Manovich in his Digital Salon essay, that period of the 1960s saw a series of conceptually radical exhibitions, including Jascha Reichert's Cybernetics Serendipity in London in 1968, The Machine at the End of the Mechanical Age, curated by Pontus Hultén, also in 1968, Software Information Technology here at the Jewish Museum, curated by Jack Burnham, Information here at MoMA, Art and Technology at the Los Angeles Contemporary Museum of Art, curated by Maurice Tuckman. this first flowering of what I would call the art, science, technology movement, I think it's useful to remind ourselves, occurred in the post-World War period, an environment, particularly in Europe and the United States, and somewhat in Japan. And I would like today to cast the art and technology movement of that period as one attempt at a cultural renaissance in the face of the tragedy of humanism in World War II. World War II was not a war to end all wars, but a dramatic failure of the glories of humanism that had developed over several centuries since the Enlightenment. Frank Malina himself had helped found UNESCO in 1947 as deputy science director, and in the early Leonardo network, there were a number of people who were very active in rebuilding internationally, both in the field of culture and in science and engineering, new organizations that were seen as the bulwark against a future breakdown in civilization represented by World War II. That generation was confronted by a number of multiple failures of humanism. Not only had Germany, birthplace of so much of the glory of European culture, given rise to Hitler, but the victorious Allies had opened up the Pandora's box of weapons of mass destruction in Hiroshima and Dresden. The anguish of that early Leonardo network lay in the fear, I think, that humanism itself was deeply flawed at its roots. And in some sense, the art and technology movement of that period can be seen as part of an attempt to build a neo-humanism that would reclaim the moral territory that seemed to have been lost. I think it's no coincidence, for instance, that Frank Oppenheimer, the brother of J. Robert Oppenheimer, went on to found the Exploratorium at San Francisco and was one of the earliest proponents of art and technology movement in the United States. Georgi Kepes, a refugee from Eastern Europe, created the CAVS at MIT out of the ruins of the Bauhaus ideals. And I must note in passing our intellectual debt to Kepes, who passed away late last year. He lived almost 100 years and brackets the whole period that we're talking about. His advocacy of artists as researchers in the heart of scientific and technological enterprise was, of course, crucial to the kind of discussion that we have championed. But secondly, his insistence on art in public spaces and in public places as the arena of creative conflict were, I think, also very, very important. Georgi Kepes did not view his target as the museum, but the world at large, and he saw the agency of the artist in the whole of the built environment around us. I want then to argue that we need to understand the anguish of post-World War II Europe and the United States as one of the contexts that led to the art and technology movement that built in the 1960s, and indeed Leonardo grew out of that period as one attempt to try and build a neo-humanism. So where are we today? I don't need to remind you that I stand here in New York at a time of particular uncertainty and questioning, and indeed many are now asking whether the neo-humanism that was built over the last 40 years is also fundamentally flawed. Our international organizations are again in peril and seem powerless to deal with the current situation. And I speak not only of September 11th in Iraq, but also of a planet in peril as overpopulation and consumption continue to decimate biodiversity, and we lose not only species but languages at a rapidly increasing rate. German philosopher Sloterdijk has articulated the case very clearly for what he sees as the first failure of humanism in World War II, and he has begun to develop an argument for the second failure. He argues that the humanism of the Enlightenment was built on a society of text and image where writing and arts could claim to build a telecommunicative association, leading indeed to a political society of shared values. Sloterdijk argues, and I'm afraid compellingly, that this illusion came to an end because the act of writing, the act of art, was no longer able to establish this telecommunicative binding within a society dominated by the mass media of radio, television, and film. and that this, he claimed, has forced humanism itself into a position of marginality and the values of the Enlightenment into those of a subculture. The neo-humanism that the art and technology movement participated in the 1960s sought to reassert cultural ownership of science and technology in the humanist agenda. Sloterdijk talks eloquently of language not as a tool of communication, but as the home of being. And indeed, in our own mythology of the internet and the virtual, we have asserted that our stay in the house of language could again be an act of deep listening, a decentering of the human in the creation of what some of our romantics in their telematic dreaming have called the creation of a mind at large in Bateson's phraseology. Sloterdijk in his writings poignantly describes in a caricature the values of the free market post-Cold War society where science and technology are part of a vast domestication project for the human spirit and potential, where the virtual and physical architecture contribute to the containment of humans in what he describes as a planetary zoological park. In his words, among humans in these little houses, some are allowed to desire, while the vast majority are the objects of desire. He argues that the neo-humanism created after World War II is failing, and that the digital divide is not, in a sense, a bug of the system, but a very feature of the system that is being built. 15 years ago, at a Leonardo editorial board meeting, Swiss artist Max Bill articulated again at that time the ethical territory as the key focus of the art, science, and technology community. Max Bill, as you know, is known for his soaring sculptures that exploit the hidden topologies of modern mathematics. For Max Bill, the use of language of mathematics was clearly the part of the creation of a neo-humanist agenda and not one of decorative exploration. 10 years ago, at another Leonardo editorial board meeting, George Gessert and Eduardo Karch launched the Leonardo Art and Biology Project to promote and document the work of artists involved with new biology and genetics, an act of willful cultural appropriation of a territory in the hands of people with other objectives. 5 years ago, Michele Emmer, an Italian mathematician and filmmaker, proposed to Leonardo a project called Artists and Scientists in Times of War. At that time, Michele was living in Italy under the flight path of the NATO bombers, dropping nightly their loads of bombs on Kosovo, which was then living the nightmare of ethnic cleansing. We live at a difficult time where, post-September 11th and Iraq, theoreticians like Paul Virilio are ready to announce the failure of neo-humanism and assert that the same science and technology that made possible a planetary culture is also one that makes a planetary-wide catastrophe inevitable. I don't share that pessimism. But whether we like it or not, I think that the digital arts themselves are fundamentally at an inflection point and at the heart of a cultural project that is very vast and difficult. And it is the assertion of the possibility of an open and involving planetary society against those that see the project as one of domestication in a planetary zoo or a return to the bestiality of war as the tool of peace. Stephen Dietz, in his Digital Salon essay, identifies 10 dreams of technology that subtend not only the art and technology movement of the 1960s, but also the digital arts of the new century. I recommend you read his essay because it got me thinking a little bit about, indeed, what are the dreams that motivate us today. These 10 dreams were the dream of symbiosis, the dream of emergence, the dream of immersion, the dream of world peace, the dream of transparency, the dream of flows, the dream of open work, the dream of the other, the dream of a new art, and hacking the dream. And so when Digital Salon, I see, is now talking about the mathematics of spirituality, maybe indeed there is some terrain there that we need to examine. Surely the new culture that we are building must continue to draw on many of those dreams that Dietz articulated in his essay. This is a symposium on the digital arts, but elsewhere in our community of artists, the focus is on the connections between the arts and the new biology. Just as the new technologies drive us to work and think on a planetary context, and indeed artists have been the very early adopters of many of the technologies of interactive telecommunication, so also biology offers us this terrain. 50 years ago this year, the structure of DNA was first elucidated, and now, in the last couple of years with the Human Genome Project, the new sciences of life are taking off. We have a growing understanding of the unity of human beings as a species, and indeed racial and ethnic distinctions are redefined in our growing knowledge of the shared genetic heritage and the history of human migration that in fact has shaped human evolution. We also understand more clearly the interconnections between the elements of the web of life on this planet. Just as a history of the 1960s began to reclaim the computer for the creation of digital art appropriate for our time, so today artists are reappropriating the biosphere, ecological environments, and genetic science into a post-humanist agenda. So I want to argue that there are differences between the 1960s and today, and that indeed we are developing today in parallel with the digital arts are central issues to do with the biological sciences and the biological technologies now at our disposal. There is a second major difference between the situation in the 1960s that I think is also clear. I've argued that in fact the art and technology movement of the 1960s, which arose mostly in Western Europe and the United States, also somewhat in Japan, was in part a reaction to the Holocaust of World War II. As we look at the art and technology movement today, it has a very, very different nature. It is truly international in scope. Clearly, we are no longer in the world of ideas and of creative work in a situation dominated by Western Europe and the United States. And I think that many of us in this community are struck by the vitality of work originating today all over the planet. In Australia, for instance, they've really been working very, very hard in the whole area of art and biology and have a leadership position today, and I think in opening up new dialogues. And in Latin and South America, the digital arts are used in very, very different ways, as made explicit in the digital art catalog this year. And so I think we must acknowledge that we need to work in different ways than we did in the 1960s, and that part of this has to do with how we collaborate with other organizations internationally to reclaim science and technology for a new post-humanist agenda. See, how am I doing on time, Bruce? I'm not sure when I started. So that's kind of a general discussion, and I don't know whether it reflects, my jet lag or I think I'm truly worried, and I truly think we need to contextualize the digital arts in that larger picture. But I wanted to share with you a recent experience that really has renewed my enthusiasm of why I think all these things we're doing is so important. One of the projects that I've been involved in now for 20 years, and as Bruce mentioned, I'm professionally a scientist. I work in astrophysics and space science, and I've always tried to find ways of creating situations where the scientific community in astrophysics and astronomy and space science could get together with the artistic community. And Leonardo, since its inception, I think in the first few issues, there were a number of projects of artists involved in outer space in some way. 7 years ago, Leonardo started a series of workshops in Paris called the Space Arts Workshops. Initially, I think the first workshop, we attracted 12 people. The fifth workshop, we had to turn people away because we reached 60 or 70, because indeed there was a growing community of people that are carrying out projects in outer space or using outer space. This resulted, coming out of those workshops, in the founding of a consortium of arts organizations called the MIR Consortium, MIR, which stands for Microgravity Interdisciplinary Research. It was founded by 5 arts organizations in a way that I think is emblematic of the kind of way that we need to work internationally today. The 5 groups are, in addition to Leonardo, are Arts Catalyst in London, V2 in Rotterdam, Project Atoll in Slovenia. Many of you know Marko Pelham, it's the organization that he comes from, and the Multimedia Center for Actual Art in Moscow. Those 5 organizations have banded together and have been submitting proposals to find ways to get, ultimately, artists into space, into orbit. That is the long-range goal of that consortium of organizations. Last week, which explains my jet lag, I just came back from Moscow with that group of organizations and 7 artists, and we flew on the Russian cosmonaut training plane. We did 29 parabolas, each time getting into zero gravity, and the artists were able to do their projects in that very unusual environment. That plane is currently used by the Russian cosmonauts, also being used to train the Chinese cosmonauts. As you know, the Chinese have a very aggressive space program and plan to start sending people into space next year. And indeed, we were working in collaboration with the engineers and trainers at the Gagarin Cosmonaut Center to create these projects. The projects ranged from Marceli Lee from Barcelona with a performance project, including he had a number of floating robots that he interacted with in zero gravity, and also interacted with a virtual system, a digital art system, using an exoskeleton structure, so it was part of his development of his performance art. There was a young crew of filmmakers who were filming sequences with a couple of actors and an actress in zero gravity for scenes that they were going to incorporate into their film. A young Russian artist had an art and biology project where he had been cultivating some cultures of bacteria on the Earth in an experiment in evolutionary biology, and then he was using the zero gravity flight as a place to induce additional evolutionary change in those organisms, which he was then bringing back to the Earth. And in addition, there was an English physiologist, a scientist, who was doing a project on trying to understand how zero gravity and variable gravity affects the human nervous system. We came back from that trip really energized by the appropriation of that space. There'll be a conference at the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London later this year, an exhibition coming out of those projects in Manchester and Rotterdam. The V2 is planning to do some workshops and include the work in the Deaf Festival next year. Those people shared a dream. You can discount that dream. But indeed, I think today there are something like 50 artists that have now created projects in zero gravity or been in zero gravity themselves. There have been artists who've launched sculptures into space vehicles. There's a very large project by a French artist right now to launch a satellite into space, which would re-enter into the Earth 50,000 years from now, and is the ultimate project in intergenerational communication. And indeed, people in our art, science, and technology community are continually appropriating areas into this cultural manifesto, this cultural agenda, and that zero gravity experience and its direct impact upon culture, I think, is easy to discount, but in fact, over the coming decades, is likely to be another strand to weave into the picture. So the theme of the symposium is Vectors, Digital Arts for Our Times. And in closing, I want to reiterate the assertion that not only are we in the stone age of the digital arts, but our arena is not primarily the art world, but somewhere oscillating in rich goals, art, science, design, engineering, quadrivium, and in the society at large. The urgency we feel is born of the current failures of neo-humanism in the world at large. And just as the art and technology movement of the 1960s rose out of the ashes of the failure of humanism in World War II, so today we must face the failure of neo-humanism in the face of today's wars, not only military, but biological. And so we must create, out of all of this, a new planetary culture that weaves again not another failed neo-humanism, but a post-humanism perhaps, that can find a third way, but between the human zoo and the amplification of bestiality that we see in the world today. Thank you very much.